Well, last week we kicked off a brand new series that we're calling Didn't See It Coming. And we're talking about 5 issues that most of us just don't really notice until they hit us, and they seem to be almost universal. So last week, we started talking about what we didn't see, and the first thing we handled was cynicism. And I got to be honest with you, I was rather surprised. I mean, all of these come out of the book that I wrote called Didn't See It Coming. We're not dealing with all 7, we're just dealing with 5, so there's more in the book, and if you were here last week, you got a free copy of the book. Copies are available today. Cheaper than you can get them at Amazon. But anyway, last week, for those of you who are here, you'll see there's bonus material, and we can't possibly cover it all in a series, but I talked about cynicism, which is the opening section of the book. What blew me away is not only how many of you said, hey, you know what, I guess I probably qualify as cynical, even though you didn't think it. And here's what got me. So many women came up to me after and said, yeah, that's my story too. And I don't know why, even though, processing this material, writing the message, writing the book, I kind of thought cynicism was a guy issue. Apparently not. So a lot of you identified with that. And the good news is what we're moving toward is once a cynic, not always a cynic. That even though hope may have died for a season, it doesn't need to stay dead forever. Not when you get Jesus involved, not when you get the cross involved, not when you get resurrection involved. And that's the same for all the issues that we're going to be covering. So next week, actually, we're going to talk about pride, and we're going to talk about it in a very surprising way. It's not just narcissism, okay? So if you're like, well, I'm not a narcissist, doesn't apply to me, you'd be surprised at how pervasive pride is, particularly among those who would consider themselves insecure. So we're going to talk about that next week. Then we're going to talk about emptiness. It's something we don't talk a lot about in our culture. The church doesn't do a good job of addressing it. Jesus talked about it all the time. And it's all about why sometimes success feels so empty. Like, what if you actually cross everything off your list and at the end you just don't feel great? What is that? And we'll talk about that because Jesus talked a lot about that, far more than we talk about it today. And then we're going to wrap up the series looking at burnout. But today, what I want to do is I want to talk about disconnection. I want to talk about this paradox we have living in the age that we do, particularly a decade into the smartphone. And I want to summarize it in a single sentence and see if you can resonate with this. That we've never been more connected as a culture, yet we've never felt more alone. We've never been more connected as a culture. I mean, the average person has 500 friends, followers on social media. Connection has never been easier. But there's a strange paradox where a number of health professionals, government officials, and more are now saying, you know what? Isolation is becoming an epidemic. That we are hyper connected, but we're not actually connected to the people that we're around. And most of us feel desperately alone. If you do some research, there was a massive study done very recently, a year or two ago, by Sigma. And they used, established methods and so on. And this is what they discovered. That 50% of people say they always or sometimes feel alone or left out. You ever felt that way? Maybe you feel that way scrolling through Instagram. It's like everyone else is having a better time than me. Everybody else seems to have their life together. I'm not having a great time. I feel left out. I feel alone. I feel like life is passing me by. I feel like my relationships aren't rich. 54% of people said no one really knows them well. That nobody really knows the actual me. 40% of people surveyed said their relationships aren't meaningful. You know what's surprising? That includes married people. It's like, yeah, this is not what I really signed up for. I don't think anybody really knows me. I feel alone. You can be married. You can be living with other people and feel completely alone. You can have a roommate in college. You can feel completely alone. You can go out every Friday night with your friends and still feel completely alone. And 40% of people, almost half, say their relationships aren't meaningful. Then they did a study based on age demographics of loneliness by age group. So UCLA years ago created this loneliness scale. It goes from 20 to 80, so not 0 to 100. So please hear what they're saying. And if you're 80, you're like profoundly isolated, almost solitary confinement. If you're 20, you're pretty connected. You don't feel lonely at all. Generation Z, which is people under about 20 years and under 22, depending on how you break it down. So basically, teenagers and emerging adults, 48.6 out of 80 on the loneliness score. In other words, over half feel profoundly lonely. And ironically, this is the most connected generation in history. Over 95% of Generation Z is on YouTube, Instagram, or Snapchat every single day. So hyper-connected, profoundly alone. You go to Millennials, which is basically early 20s to almost 40, and they aren't much different. It's 45.3 on the loneliness scale. Then you look at baby boomers. Baby boomers are also lonely. Their stat is 42.4 on the loneliness scale. And then for elders, age 72 plus, it's actually the lowest. It's 38.6. What was fascinating to me is like, hey, I'm Gen Z, or I'm Gen X. Anybody else Gen X? I can say I'm Gen Z. See, there's 3 of us who are Generation X. We don't even rate. And that's been the story of our generation from the very beginning, is no one pays attention to us. But they didn't even study us. So I don't know where we are. We're probably not lonely at all. But anyway, if you're Generation X, you know what I'm talking about. We didn't rate in this study. So if you look at this, this is paradoxical. The older you are, the less isolated you feel. The younger you are and the more connected you are, the more lonely you feel. Which is also interesting because early in 2018, the British government, the United Kingdom government, appointed a minister for loneliness. Not a minister of loneliness, go sit there in the corner all by yourself, but a minister for loneliness, because in England, they've identified loneliness among seniors as an epidemic. Something like over 200,000 senior adults in the United Kingdom haven't talked to a single human being in the last 30 days in person. And so they're like, this is an epidemic, we have to deal with it. And loneliness is deadly. If you look at some of the emerging data, some of the health data, some of the science data, many scientists now say that there is a direct link between loneliness and early death. Some of the research says that being lonely or feeling isolated will actually increase your risk of mortality by 30 to 60%. Other studies have said that being lonely, isolated, and cut off is kind of like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That somehow, and you know this, but we don't want to admit it, that the way we live our lives socially is completely and deeply connected to our physiology and even our life. Loneliness and isolation can kill you, literally. So the question is, what's going on? What's going on? And it's easy to say, oh, I'll tell you what's going on. You know, ever since smartphone was invented, ever since Wi-Fi, I remember dial-up days. Do you remember how hard it was to get on the internet? Do you remember when you got like 4 emails a day, now you get 400? I mean, wouldn't it be great to go back to those days? You know what? It's not just a technology problem. It is a technology problem, but it's not a technology problem. It's like people who say, you know, majority of marriages that break up. Facebook's the problem. Someone from high school reached out to her, now she's not interested in me. Marriages were breaking up long before Facebook, okay? Marriages were breaking up long before people could connect with old flames and that kind of thing. It's not just a technology problem. It's a human problem. It's a human problem. If you think back past a decade, you think back to your own childhood, you think back to when you were a kid, connection wasn't automatic. Sometimes families didn't connect. You barely had dinner together. When you had dinner together, the TV was on in the kitchen or in the dining room or the living room, or you all ate independently. Back when there were landlines, anyone remember landlines? 3 of us, okay. But do you remember there was a teenager phone that sometimes people would get installed? It's like, we don't want you to tie up the main line, so you got your own phone, and your sister, usually it was your sister, would stay in a room all night long talking to her friends. I mean, the brother was lost in video games. And you know what the dad did? Yeah, he didn't have a cell phone. He didn't have those things. But he would disappear into the garage and work on his 68 Camaro that was never, ever done. You know why it was never done? Because he didn't want it to be done. He didn't want to connect with anybody. It's like, this is my escape. I bring my drink, I go out into the garage, I ignore you. It's not just a technology problem, it's a human problem. You have a propensity to hide. You have the propensity to disconnect. And you're like, well, the reason I disconnect is because people are hurtful. Because whenever I connect in community, I seem to get my heart snapped. We talked about that a little bit last week. We talked about growing cynical and how that happens. No, the reason I don't is I don't want anyone to really see inside. I don't want people to see how bad it really is. I don't want to see people. It's a human problem. This goes back. If you want to trace this theologically, all you have to do, Genesis is the first book in the Bible. Flip 1 or 2 pages, come to Genesis 3. You'll realize this goes right back to the dawn of humanity. Fear and hiding and shame. It's not just, it is a technology problem, but it's deeper than that. It's a human problem because technology, your phone, your computer, it's basically like paper. Paper can be used for good. Paper can be used for evil. I mean, paper can be used to write the most beautiful poetry or literature in the world, or it can be used by an arsonist to start a fire that burns down a house. Paper can be used for incredible art, and it can be used for destructive porn. I mean, paper can be used for anything you want. It's so say, well, paper's evil. No, paper's neutral. You know what? Paper gets used by people, and we have a mixture of good and evil in our hearts. And guess what? Technology gets used by people, and we have a mixture of good and evil in our hearts. And technology, as we've always said around here, does it have a propensity to take you down the road? Yes, but it just reveals and amplifies what's already there. If you want to have an affair, technology can help you. If you want to connect with people in a meaningful, life-giving way, technology can help you. If you want to blow up your life, technology will help you. I mean, it just reveals and amplifies what you've already got inside. Now, this is going to seem like a hard right or a hard left, all right, not politically, just like what? How did we get here in the message? I want to talk about something that seems like it's totally unrelated, but I don't think it's totally unrelated. And I want to talk about 2 premature deaths in our culture. That literally in my lifetime and a lot of your lifetimes, I've watched 2 things kind of die before my eyes. This is not research-based, this is anecdotal, but I want to see if you can relate, okay? The first death I think I've noticed is the death of conversation. Seems like in the last decade, really good, life-giving, meaningful conversations are getting harder and harder to find. What I'm getting a lot of these days is just people who are talking at you, not talking with you. It's funny, you go back, and I think this might be a product of isolation or loneliness. Some of you know when I started here over 20 years ago, the churches that I came to serve were really small. A couple of you remember that. And I mean, when you have 6 people, you go visit people, you visit senior shut-ins. Now we have 3,000 to 4,000 who call our church home. So, you know, that's different. We now scale community through you. You guys get together in circles and group link and the whole deal. But I used to go visit people, and I was nervous because you don't really get like trained for that in seminary. It's like, go visit people. So I would visit the senior citizens who were shut in their apartment or their condo or whatever. I'm like, what am I going to talk about for an hour? I learned pretty quickly that all you had to do was say hello. And about an hour later, they'd finish what they were saying. Because they hadn't talked to anybody in a month. And it's like, okay, well, can I pray for you? You know, that's it. And then you're done. That was your whole visit. So I learned that. But conversation these days feels like a monologue. You say hello, how are you? And you get just da-da-da-da-da. And what I noticed, and I've talked about this with my wife, I've now started talking to, again, this is anecdotal, just with friends. I'm like, you know what? People don't ask me questions. People don't ask me how I am. People don't seem to ask me at the same level what's going on in my life. It's almost as though all people are doing, or what a lot of what we're doing these days, is posting social status updates in real life. Here's what's going on in my life. Here's what's going on. Here's what happened here. Here's what happened there. And listen, sometimes we all need to get something off our chest. But I remember last year I was talking to this guy. He's like, hey, can we meet? I've got some questions for you. I'm like, sure. So I decided to meet with him. And I noticed that, oh my goodness, he's just talking and talking and talking. So I thought, you know what? I'm trying to stay engaged, but I'm going to time this. 28 minutes. I didn't say a word. Not a word. 28 minutes. Just on and on and on about subject after subject after subject. You know what a real conversation is? It's a tennis match. It's like, tell me about what's going on in your life. Oh, okay. How about you? Yeah, you know what? I've seen this too. Well, what about you? Yeah. And it kind of goes back and forth. And yeah, sometimes you have conversations that are maybe 80-20, but you shouldn't have conversations that are 99-1, and conversations kind of dying. What's with that? Here's another thing that's dying in our culture: confession. Confession. Because guess what? We live in an age where nothing's my fault. It's not my fault. It's the government. It's the school system. It's the education. It's the economy. It's my ex. It's just the culture, all right? Hey, nothing's wrong with me. It's my parents. It's my siblings. It's my kids. Nothing sticks to me. I got nothing going wrong with me. I don't have any issues. Hey, that is just a coping mechanism, okay? Nothing's wrong with me. We don't confess anymore. That's even a weird word, isn't it? Like some of you grew up, what was confession? If you grew up in the church and you were sort of in our tradition, confession was something you did privately. It's something you did in your bedroom or first thing in the morning, and you kind of secretly confessed your sins to God. If you grew up Roman Catholic, you got into a booth with a guy in a collar on the other side, and you just kind of let it off your chest, and then you went out and tried not to do it again. I mean, it was kind of weird. And we'll look at confession from a different perspective, but nobody really confesses their sins anymore. I mean, you sit down with any counselor, any Christian counselor, and they'll be like, yeah, you come in, it's all about, hey, my spouse or my family or my boss or my this or my that. It's like, well, what do you own? Well, I don't own anything. I'm a victim. Very few people put up their hand and go, you know what? The way I handled that was completely inappropriate. You know what? When I said that, I hurt you. Confession seems to have died, and it's also died in the church. We don't confess our sins anymore, and we need to. Now, I want to take you to a passage of Scripture which was written by Jesus' half-brother, a guy named James. All right, so shared the same mother, Mary, and he came to believe that this brother that he grew up with was the Son of God and rose from the dead, which is quite a feat if you think about it. I mean, if your brother came back and said, hey, I'm the Son of God and I rose from the dead, would you believe him? Probably not. But James did. James did. And look at this. This is what he had to say, because he was convinced after he watched Jesus' life that Jesus was who he said he was. And now he's trying to figure out what that means for them after Jesus was raised from the dead. And he says, okay, Christians, you want to know how to be the church? Here's how to be the church. And if you've been around the church for a while, you probably know this passage. It gets quoted quite a bit. If not, just come along for the journey. Are any of you suffering hardships? You should pray. Now, what it means by suffering is it just means, are any of you in trouble? Are any of you struggling? Are any of you having issues? And most of us at some point would go, yeah, that would be me. I had a really bad week, or I'm in a bad season in my life, or I really can't deal with this issue that's been in my past. Well, you should pray. And a lot of us, we just immediately go to private. We're like, okay, I'll pray about it. And then he says this, are any of you happy? You should sing praises. But then he says this, and this is what a lot of Christians love to quote. Are any of you sick? Now, when you see that word sick, what do you think of? You know what most of us think of? Like, oh, you mean like cancer, or I just don't feel good, or I got some medical condition, or I got a diagnosis. Like, is that what you're talking about? That's not actually, we interpret it that way in the church. That's not actually what the Greek means. What it means is it can include physical illnesses, but more likely it means, are any of you in anguish? Are any of you struggling? Any of you, like, you got issues with your mental health? Any of you really anxious, worried, perplexed, frustrated? Any of you struggling? Any of you sick to the soul? That's what it actually means. It's not just, do you have a medical condition you need to go to ER? It's like, What's going on in your life? Any of you struggling with things going on in your life? And that kind of catches all of us, doesn't it? In one season or another. Well, then what do? You should call for the elders of the church to come and pray over you, anointing you with oil in the name of the Lord. Now, their churches were very small. They were house churches. So you have a dozen people. There are 1 or 2 elders, maybe 3 elders who were in the local church. You know, when you have a church our size and multiple locations, that's kind of what small group is about. So we've just diffused that over many, many small groups and hundreds of people. And so you should get together in your group. You should get together, and we got a group link coming up, so don't miss that at our locations, okay? You should actually get together as the church and pray over you, anointing you with oil in the name of the Lord. And then there's this claim that we reference again and again. Such a prayer offered in faith will heal the sick, and the Lord will make you well. Now, that gets misinterpreted because it's like, well, my cancer didn't go away, or I still got this condition, or the doctors say I'm not cured. What do you mean the Lord will make you well if you pray about this? I prayed about it, it didn't happen. Well, you're thinking medical. He's saying, hey, what is going on in your heart? What's going on in your mind? What's going on in your soul? What's going on in your life? What's broken in your marriage? What are you struggling with in parenting? What about that addiction you don't want to talk about? What's with all that? That's a sickness too. And then he does what seems like it's totally out of character, but it's not. And if you've committed any sins, you will be forgiven. Wait a minute, I thought we were talking about sickness, and now you're talking about forgiveness. Wait, how did you just jump from what's wrong in my life to now your sins are forgiven? I don't get it. With James, you're going all over the place here. No, he's not. They're all connected. Because look at what he says in the next sentence. He says, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. Now, if you grew up in the church, you think sin is private because that's how we treat it, because confession's dying. No, it's not. Sin is public. You committed those sins in public. And you need to talk about them in public. And you need to take all that private stuff that you and God have been talking about for a while. It's like, I'm just trying to really curb this addiction. I'm really trying to deal with my temper. I'm really trying to deal with my anger. And you need to make it public. And you need to talk to each other about it. And you're like, oh, no, we don't do that because I'm ashamed. And we'll talk about shame next week. But biblically, this is our problem. It's like, no, you're supposed to confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. I do some speaking on the road sometimes, and last fall I was on the road. And eating healthy on the road is not always easy. Some people manage to do it quite well. I always struggle in that regard. And it was a long travel day. I was heading to Memphis. And when I got to Toronto, I kind of had, there was a cookie available at the kiosk, so I took a cookie, and so I had that. And then on the plane, you got a meal, and the meal included dessert, so I had that. And then I got to the speaking venue, and they had, if you're a speaker, they often have your meal backstage, and so they had it set up for all of us who were speaking, and they brought in Southern barbecue, which I like, and is not a sin, all right? So they had Southern barbecue, which was great, but then they had like banana pudding, which if you've ever had that in the South, is unbelievable. So I had to have some banana pudding. And then we were backstage in the green room getting ready to go on stage. They had M&Ms. And then I went out with a friend of mine who was in town from Atlanta, and we hung out, and we went to this restaurant, and he said, I feel like ordering dessert. So we had dessert. I got back to the hotel room, and I went, oh my gosh, I had 5 desserts today. 5 desserts. Like, when was the last time you had 5 desserts in a single day? I had 5 desserts that day. And I thought, this is terrible. So what do I do about it? I'm alone in my hotel room. The next day I go and I say to a few of my friends who are also speaking, I'm like, do you know how many desserts I had last night? 5 desserts. I started confessing my sins out loud. And then I went on a sugar fast. I'm like, that's it. I'm not having sugar. And I went months without sugar. I'll tell you, the first few days were horrible. Absolutely horrible. I'm sitting the next day at lunch in the green room. They bring in these monster cookies. I'm like, no. No. But I had to confess my sins out loud. And there's something about knowing you had 5 cookies, knowing you had 5 desserts, and telling someone you respect, guess what? Yesterday I had 5 desserts. I think I need to go cold turkey. See, what if you said to somebody, you know what? I drink every single day. I can't remember the last time I didn't have a drink. That's very different than knowing that you drink every day. What about your drug habit? You know what? I smoke every Friday and almost every day after work. If you have to say that out loud, what about, hey, I lose my temper at home all the time. Guess what? We had 3 scream fests at our house this week. See, that gets kind of awkward and uncomfortable, doesn't it? But that's what confession is. Hey, my porn problem, every single day. If you say that out loud, that's very different than struggling with it privately. You know what? That happens in our groups. And if you're not in a group, you need to get into a group. And in the final part of this series, I'm going to talk about burnout. You know what was absolutely pivotal in my recovery from burnout? Having a group around me that would come to my house and pray for me when I was burned out. Having a group around me that I could say, you know what, it's not going very well at home, and Tony and I are not in a great place. We'll talk about that later this fall in a separate series. See, if you start to confess your sins, not just to God, but to each other, and admit that you are not who you wish you were, and not who people think you are, and you start to pray for each other, I need help, guess what? You are way more likely to be healed. True? So what do you need to confess? And who are you going to tell? The earnest prayer of a righteous person has great power and produces wonderful results. So, where does that leave us this week? A couple of things. Number one, I want you to get out of your isolation. I want you to get out of your loneliness. I want you to get into a place where to the people that matter most to you, you really start to connect. You really start to connect. And then you start to confess. And maybe for you, it's absolutely terrifying to admit where you are. And listen, this is a community of grace and truth. And you can't really have Jesus' form of grace without truth. And you can't really have Jesus' form of truth without grace. And maybe you just need, instead, next time if you pray, and I hope you pray about these things, maybe you just need to say it out loud to God. Guess what? I had 5 desserts yesterday. And that's the first step to telling somebody else, guess what? I had 5 desserts yesterday. Guess what? It's been a long time since I was sober. Guess what? I'm having an affair. By the way, only the dessert part is autobiographical, if you're wondering, okay? Before you're like, woo, church is in crisis. But you know, these things happen. And they're happening in some of your lives right now. And you need to get help. So connect and confess, because the isolation's killing you. Solitude is a gift from God. I start every day in solitude. It's replenishing. I get up before the sun. I have some time, and when the weather's nice on the back deck, I open up my Bible, I pray, I reflect, I thank God. That is a gift. It is life-giving. But isolation is a tool of the enemy. And for a lot of us, it's not solitude we have, it's isolation. And so this week, what I want you to do is start disconnecting to reconnect. Disconnect to reconnect. So what can you do? I want to give you some hacks. There's more in the book if you want to go deeper. But in the time we have available, I want to give you some hacks. Number one, try listening. Most of us are pretty good at being the speaker. But try listening. And here's what you're going to discover. If you listen longer than most people listen, you'll hear things most people never hear. So I do a podcast almost every week, leadership podcast. And we run the bonus episodes sometimes on the Connexus podcast, so there's a bit of cross-pollination. And anyway, I've been doing this for about 4 years. And I just interview leaders, and I ask them questions about their life and leadership. I'm usually looking for the backstory. We try to have really honest conversations. And I was 4 or 5 episodes in, and Tony, my wife, and I were in the car, and I asked her, "What do you think?" And she just said, "Oh, you talk too much." Is that like a marriage thing or a podcast thing? Like, what is that? And she said, "No, you interrupt your guest and you talk too much." And I really took that to heart. And so I worked really hard on shutting up. And 3 years later, I'm still working at multiple levels of shutting up. And you know what I've learned as an interviewer? If you shut up, amazing things happen. If you listen longer than most people listen, you will hear things that most people never hear. So I talk to leaders, sometimes very well-known leaders in the church world, who lead very large churches. And I'm learning now, because I always do, it's an audio podcast, but I do the podcast by video. And now my new thing is, they're kind of done. They've finished their 3 minutes or whatever answer to the question. They're kind of done. And I'll just, because they can see me and I can see them via video, I'll just go, and then I won't say a word. And they'll be like, "Ooh." And then they'll tell me more. And then they'll tell me more. And then I start getting texts from their staff going, "I've worked with this guy for 15 years. He's never told us that." It's amazing. If you listen longer than most people listen, you'll hear things most people never hear. So listen. And before you think it's about interviewing top leaders, how about this? How about you start with your spouse if you're married? How about you start with your kids? How about you start with somebody, and instead of you being the talker, you become the listener. And just listen. Maybe turn off your devices. That's another thing that can really help. My phone's on Do Not Disturb. You see that little moon, if you can see it up close? It's got a little moon. It's been on Do Not Disturb for about 1.5 years. Because otherwise, every 3 minutes, my phone just buzzes and vibrates and whatever. I just turn off all the notifications. My phone's on Do Not Disturb. I can have much more focused conversation, much more focused work. Even though I wear a watch, a smartwatch, it's on Do Not Disturb. Because otherwise, I'm talking to you, and my phone's buzzing, and my watch is buzzing, and so now that's just all off. And you're like, "Well, what if you miss something?" I miss everything. It's okay. If the house was on fire, someone would come and tell me, right? They would. If somebody would knock on my door if it was really bad. And I'm fidgety enough that probably every half hour I look at my phone anyway. Even long before there were smartphones, we made some decisions when we first got married. And we said, we're not putting a TV on the main floor. We're not putting a TV in our kitchen. Kitchen's about relationship. Family time is about meal time. So there's never been a TV in our kitchen. We never put a TV in our bedroom because we said that's about relationship, among other things. You would think we'd have 17 kids, but we only have 2. So I don't know what to say about that. But you know what? You want to connect in a meaningful way. And so we've always had technology-free zones in our house. And when our kids were growing up, we never put DVD players in the car. I mean, back then you had to have them in your car. Now you just have, tablets and that kind of thing. I finally have one, but my kids are grown, and it's just because it came with the car. But I don't even know how to use it. Why? Because we want to make cars about conversation. We want to make cars about relationship. And we would do these long road trips. You put a 3-year-old in the backseat of the car for 15 hours, and they eventually figure out they're not getting out of jail. So, they figure it out, and you sing songs, and you play games, and you do that. And listen, I'm a driven person. I'm an extremely driven person. I'm entrepreneurial. I'm all those things. But here's what I've realized as I've reflected on this. When it comes to connection, love has a speed, and it's slower than you are. Love has a speed. It's slower than I am. Dallas Willard put it this way. He said, the one thing you must do if you want to connect with God and connect with others is you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. That's a challenge for me every day. Because my task list is this long, and my time's that big. So I've got to learn that I have to unplug meaningful parts of my life, kind of like Little House on the Prairie. Do you remember that show? Anybody? I knew it was on when I was a kid, and I never liked it when I was a kid. But last summer, as I was writing this book, I was just looking for a way to unplug. I had the TV on. I'm scrolling through, I think it was iTunes or Netflix or something like that. And I scrolled upon Little House on the Prairie, and I'm like, oh, that's weird. I bought the entire series on whim. I have no idea why. I don't even like it. Bought the entire series on whim. And then I thought, I'm going to watch the pilot. It's a 2-hour pilot. So it was a show shot in the 1970s that was set in the 1870s about homesteaders. And oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it. I mean, you see movies now and it's like explosions every 3 seconds and, jump shots and reaction shots and boom, 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 boom. Little House on the Prairie, it's like peanut butter and molasses had a baby. It is so slow. It is and there's no plot. There's no plot. It's like we went to Minnesota and there was a squirrel. 2 hours, all right, 2 hours. I'm watching this thing. I only watched the pilot. That was it. But I'm like, something's happened in our culture. I mean, you should watch it. If you can just see it on YouTube. It is so slow. And I'm like, my grandfather was born in the 1890s, right? I'm like, this is what life was like. And you look at our life, no wonder we're disconnected. No wonder we're we can't handle it. So unplug, because this is true. Love pauses. Love pauses. Love lingers. And love offers full focus and gives far more than it takes. And here's what I think you're going to learn this week as you disconnect to reconnect. That in the process of connecting with others, you might finally connect with God. And you might even connect with yourself. Because when you're going so fast, and when you're constantly connected, and I'm very connected, you'll never connect with the people you love the most. You'll never really know yourself. And you need to. You need to know God. Love has a speed, and it's slower than you are. So this week, slow down. Connect with God. Connect with people. Confess. Converse. Because love has a speed, and it's slow. As we close the service at our locations today, just going to give you a couple of minutes because, hey, in 3 or 4 minutes, you're going to be out there. You're going to be picking up your kids. It's going to be like, where are we going for lunch? And you're going to be right back in the world. We're just going to give you a couple of minutes to reflect, to pray, to think about what you are going to do to slow down and connect.